we're government, so we tend to think of disasters and everything. We always think of the government structures, but disasters don't hit government. They hit neighborhoods, they hit communities. And so one of the things we found was when we just talk about government, we leave a lot of resources off the table. So we wanted to change that discussion, because we always talk about what government's going to do. We never really talk about, well, what's the private sector doing? What are the volunteers and NGOs? Not just those that are active in disasters, like our partners at Red Cross and Salvation Army, but as we saw in Katrina, a lot of the initial response was just organizations that sprang up from other non-disaster purposes to help out, and then the public itself. I like to say we tend to look at the public as a liability. We call them victims. I think they're resources. I think they're survivors. And so we look at the resiliency of communities as, how are those structures done? Are people prepared? Do they understand risk? What about the volunteer organizations? What about the organizations that are actually advocacy groups? How are they tied in? And then what's the business sector doing? And so we can see from if they are better prepared on the preparedness side, their response to disasters is better. It doesn't mean there's not devastation or damage, but their response is better and their recovery is better. Building insurable structures. We a lot of times in government use a lot of fancy words, but what I really try to get down to is, if it's not insurable, why did we build it the way we built it, where we built it? And when I talk about schools, I talk about fire stations, 911 centers, people forget, if those aren't insured, you, the federal taxpayer, are on the hook if disaster strikes. Wouldn't it make more sense if we built in such a way that it was insurable and was affordable? So local governments weren't always using a disaster to have to rebuild, but if there was a local event or even a large-scale disaster, we're better utilizing the private sector to manage and support that risk. So we know that in many cases we have the science, we know how to build better, but we're oftentimes behind in our codes or adoption of standards. And so one of the other things we're doing is not just looking at past data to make decisions, but looking at future risk and the best information available. So when we go back and we rebuild a school, it doesn't really matter to us if there's no requirement to build a safe room. If a tornado hit, we know the standard should be a safe room, so we're going to build it into the school, not just rely upon, well, it didn't have one before, so we're just going to rebuild it the way it was. That's irresponsible. So we look at not just what the local community codes are, but we look at the best science. So when we do use your dollars to rebuild, we're building to the best available data, best available science, and hopefully that increases the insurability. I think we really have to focus on how do we communicate low event that have high consequence, what we generally call the low probability, high consequence events. I don't think we give local decision makers good tools to deal with what some people will consider outliers, but could be of such that it would destroy or render a community unable to recover from the event. And in many cases, we use a lot of terminology that's very much science-based, like 100-year events to describe a 1% event. Local officials don't always understand that that means it's a 1% annual risk, not just that it happens once every 100 years. And as we have better data, like how do you communicate things like climate change, where there's so much uncertainty into that, when they're having to make very pragmatic decisions about where and how they build in land use and building codes that come up daily. So I think part of this is, how do we translate the knowledge we have about hazards into actions that they can take that make sense, that are affordable, and buy down risk in such a way that they're less prone to being devastated in a disaster, they're more resilient, they recover faster. The goal here is that we'll never have disasters, but that they're survivable. Communities are able to overcome them and not require tremendous outflows of capital from the taxpayer to do that, but it's more built into how we build and design, use the private sector to manage risk, and we protect our economy, our tax base, our businesses, and our communities better, which ultimately means that even though these may be outlying events sometimes, they may be infrequent, but they will happen, the community survives it in a way that is much more productive than what we have seen in previous disasters. Well, I think when you talk about resilience, you talk to the average person, they're going to go, huh? So I'd rather not talk about resilience. I want to talk about Let's talk about home ownership. For most people, that's their single biggest investment. It's something we strive to, and as we saw in the recent downturn, many people lost. We need to get people to understand what the total cost of home ownership is. It isn't just a mortgage. It's the insurability, it's the energy cost, it's the maintenance of that home. And I think we need to give better people better tools so they make better investments and better informed decisions, because when you talk to people about resiliency, they don't get it. When you talk about, you don't want to find yourself in a situation that too many of my fellow Floridians found themselves in. After 4 hurricanes, they found themselves in a situation where they were underinsured. The value of their homes had grown, but their insurance had never kept up, and the damages were greater than their insurance. So here they are. They thought they were insured. They weren't covered with enough insurance. They could not make repairs to their homes. They couldn't continue to pay their mortgage. They lost everything. To me, being resilient is, I understand what my home cost. I have the right insurance. I'm not in a situation that a disaster can financially ruin me. But I've seen too many people who didn't understand what insurance covered, what those costs were, not understanding what rebuilding was going to be like, and they lost everything.